Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Very welcome to this technical briefing session on AMR poll incentives. I'm Colin Leonard, Chief Clinical Officer for biotech called Infex Therapeutics, which has a pipeline of antimicrobial agents. I'm also a practicing pulmonologist in the UK, and I was the clinical lead for the UK subscription model project. So I'm moderating the session here today. I'm really excited about it. We've got a stellar list of speakers and interesting topics. If people do want to speak or ask questions, there is a microphone button at each of the tables here. Please make sure to press the button nearest to you because it directs the camera in your direction. And of course, when you finish speaking, press the button to turn off the microphone also. So the first section is eligibility criteria needed to ensure diversity in the pipeline. And our first speaker, I'm very pleased to welcome Marco Cavalieri from the European Medicines Agency to talk us through some key factors that they consider for evaluating antimicrobials. So Marco, over to you if you could give your presentation.
Good morning to all of you, and it's my pleasure to be here to talk about this important public health issue. And I will start by saying that the European Medicine Agency is now sadly 2 decades since we saw this growing threat in a pipeline of new antibiotics that was becoming thinner and thinner. And I don't think we have seen yet turning the tide, and we need to think carefully about what kind of incentives can be put in place in order to make sure that good candidates get rewarded and that the private sector has really a tangible incentive to continue putting effort into research and development of new antibiotics that would tackle the issue of antimicrobial resistance. So I will start by saying that we at the EMA, the first thing that we did was to revise our requirements to make sure that new antibiotics could be approved as soon as possible, taking advantage also not only of having sufficient amount of clinical data, but also taking into account all the evidence that could come from translational science, in particular microbiology and PKPD, which was underused until then. And therefore, using all these tools, we were able to come up with a new plan and a new set of requirements that would allow a new antibiotic that would be extremely promising in tackling multi-drug resistance organisms to be approved as rapidly as possible. Of course, this comes with the price that you will not have a lot of data available at time of authorization around how really will work in patients with a variety of different type of resistance and in different types of organisms. And of course, this calls for continuing in the evidence collection after the approval phase. And the other important point is that we were able to come out with global alignment with respect to the requirements on the approval of new antibiotics, because it's very important not to forget that, and that was our primary scope, was to come up with achieving an agreement across regulatory bodies in the world that a single clinical development program would satisfy the requirements by all agencies in the world. And we started this work roughly 10 years ago with the US FDA and Japanese regulatory agency PMDA, now expanded also to Health Canada, expanded to the Transatlantic Task Force on Antimicrobial Resistance, and now the next step is to bring these across all the different continents and all the agencies in the world. We started work with the African region, we started work also with the Asian regions, and Southeastern Asia is really affected by an incredibly high level of antimicrobial resistance. So we need to continue this international work in making sure that the same development program would satisfy regulatory agencies all over the world. Beside that, on your specific point about eligibility, because indeed, once a new antibiotic is approved, we fixed, if I can say so, the regulatory requirement to allow a rapid approval of a new antibiotic in Europe, but also all over the world. We need to think how to guarantee access, but also importantly, how to make sure the industry will invest in this antibiotic, because the problem that they face is what happens afterwards when a new antibiotic gets approved, but not used because it will be kept in reserve, and therefore, there is not really a market. This indeed is a system that would allow to be prepared for what will come next. But we need to think about what is going to be the return on investment for whoever will want to put efforts and money in this area. So it's really important to think about incentives, and we are really glad to see that now finally something is moving, even if we still think there is a long way to go, and we need to think more about incentives that could have really a tangible impact. Because let me remind you here, the scope would be to put in place incentives that would push the private sector to invest in R&D. It's not just about guaranteeing access of a product that is already developed and approved. It's about making sure that the private sector will invest in this area because they will have a return on investment. So that's why, in order to achieve this, the broader the agreement is on investment and on the pool incentives, not only from single countries, but across regions, and maybe to be as broad as possible, will be the only way to be impactful and to guarantee really a good level of pool incentives for the private sector. But of course, as everybody knows, we need to think very carefully how we spend our money, how governments are spending money. So we need to down select very carefully those products that are really amenable for these incentives, that are really bringing something new and valuable with respect to tackling AMR and multi-drug resistance infection. And that's why at DMA, now that the emergency task force has been established after COVID-19 and is range of actions is covering also AMR as one of the most important health threats that we are facing and we will be facing in the future. We are ready to take our role and to help in defining which kind of antibiotics in Europe could be eligible, let's say for the voucher or for any other incentives that might be put in place in Europe. And this should be conducted based on clear criteria, but it cannot be too simplistic. It cannot just be a WHO list, even if the WHO list would be a very good starting point, and we don't see the need of coming up with a European list. The WHO list, in our perspective, is good enough. But of course, this should be complemented with many other areas that would indicate whether a new product is providing some added value on top of our armamentarium. And this is the microbiological profile to start with, of course, but not only that, it's also about the safety, it's also about the ease of use, it's also about the route of administrations, it's also about many other aspects like co-administration with other agents. And all this has to be taken into account into a list of key criteria that would help understanding whether any new product that gets to approval then could be eligible for this type of voucher. And of course, the clinical impact is what matters the most. So what is the ability or the potential ability, because as said, at time of approval, the clinical evidence might be limited, but it would be very important to understand based on what is available at that time, including all the microbiological data, or the data on translational science that would indicate that these new agents has really a potential of having an impact in treating or preventing multi-drug resistant infection. And that's what we at DMA, we are ready to do. And we are ready to cooperate with all the players, with European institutions, with European commissions, in order to make sure that we will come up with a system that is efficient, credible, flexible, and able to reward those products that really deserve to be rewarded. Thank you very much.
Super, thank you, Marco. Just in case people weren't aware, there's an opportunity for questions at the end of this particular section, but before that, we'll ask Sophie Cooper from UK NICE to talk about the UK model, the eligibility and evaluation criteria used in that model. And then I say after Sophie's talk, there'll be an opportunity to ask both Marco and Sophie and the UK team questions. So if I could call on Sophie Cooper. Sophie, thanks for joining us. We could have your presentation, thanks.
Thanks for having me. I do have some slides. Will they be shared in the room or should I share them? Sorry, we didn't work that out beforehand.
Up to you, Sophie. I can share it.
Yeah, if you can. I'm not familiar with WebEx, so let's avoid any unnecessary technical issues. So thank you for having me. the colour of the slides has gone a bit strange, but that's fine. My name is Sophie Cooper. I work in the science policy team at NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, which is the health technology assessment body in England. And on the next slide, you'll see our purpose at NICE is to help practitioners and commissioners get the best care to people fast while delivering value to the taxpayer, which I guess is pretty critical in these discussions. And I've been leading NICE's contribution to the UK subscription model in recent years, but I'm also joined online by my NICE colleague Nick Crabb, who really spearheaded this work for NICE, and the lead from our National Health Service, David Glover, who's speaking to you later this morning. So on the next slide, you'll see, I just wanted to recap on how the UK model works so we're all on the same page. So this is a fully de-linked subscription model in which our NHS, the National Health Service, offers the company a contract for a fixed annual amount, regardless of how much their antimicrobial is used. And that contract is offered for an initial 3 years, with the option to extend up to 16 years or until loss of patent exclusivity. And the contract value is based on the NICE-led evaluation against 17 criteria, which I'll come on to. And importantly, to differentiate between different products of different value and as has been alluded to, you know, kind of make sure we've got a diversity in our portfolio. There are 4 possible contract values shown on the slide, ranging from about 6 million to 24 million per product per year so that's for the whole of the UK. It's also possible the evaluation results in no contract being awarded if the product doesn't score well enough. So on the next slide, we have the 17 criteria that we assess each product against. And the total score is a weighted average of the scores across these 17, where the weighting that you can see down the right-hand side reflects the relative importance of each of these criteria to the overall value of an antimicrobial, which we elicited from our panel of experts. We've got sort of 3 broad buckets. So relative effectiveness and unmet needs, you can see carries the highest weighting as a category, 45%, and the focus being on global unmet need. You see that the WHO priority pathogen list carries the biggest weighting, and indeed at the moment only products active against WHO priorities are eligible for the scheme, because, you know, as you know, it's important that we work together on this. No country can fix the market on our own. So for example, the UK, we represent only 2 to 3% of the market, so we need to make sure our pull incentives are aligning with pull incentives across the world and all pulling in the same direction, so we can get a meaningful sort of global scale of a commercial incentive. Then we've got the second category around pharmacological benefits, so the novelty, kind of the innovation criteria as defined by the WHO, impact on gut microbiome, and whether it achieves sort of clinically relevant drug exposures, and finally health system benefits, so step changes in, for example, of the mode of administration that allow, you know, outpatient delivery or even delivery at home, easier storage and preparation, better safety, reduced monitoring, less time in hospital, all these things that are really important to our healthcare systems and indirectly to tackle AMR. I mentioned the focus on global unmet needs. You'll see we also do consider our local UK unmet needs in criterion 1C. And there's a lot more detail behind all of these. The hyperlink at the bottom there takes you to the full explanation of the criteria, the scoring, and all the supporting evidence that a company must provide behind these. I'll come back to how we devise them in a bit more detail in a moment, but just to say, as important context for anyone familiar with how NICE usually evaluates drugs, it's not like this. So our approach is to use quantitative health economic modelling, more specifically cost utility analysis, to assess whether a drug offers value for money. And we express that as the incremental cost of a drug versus what's used in practice at the moment per quality adjusted life year gained, or QALY gained, so per extra year in full health. And it's important to say that we did attempt this cost utility approach with antimicrobials in our pilot scheme with Cazavi and Sevateragol, which were the first 2 de-linked contracts awarded in the UK. And this is really important context for how we developed these evaluation criteria. So I'll take you through the pilot briefly to set that context. So on the next slide, just a summary of how we did that. So as I said, we used our normal approach of health economic modelling, to look at the value of each drug in our sort of normal unit in quality adjusted life years. We did modify that approach slightly. So we took into account the broader public health benefits of antimicrobials that we don't normally look at for other drugs. And these are commonly referred to using the acronym STEADY, which you may have come across, which I won't walk through in detail, but the definition of that acronym is on the screen. So really important attributes of antimicrobials in the fight against AMR. And then the QALY value for each drug was translated to a monetary value to inform the contract value, the annual fee these companies now receive. And on the next slide, you'll see now how we sort of move from the pilot to the system we've got in place now. So of course, it gave us some really comprehensive case studies of evaluating antimicrobials on a health economic basis. But there were really big gaps in the evidence base and a lot of uncertainty. And it was extremely sort of resource intensive. It would have been a difficult thing to do this sort of quantitative health economic analysis on a product by product. But a really positive finding that supported our move to the new system is that when estimating the value of these drugs in QALYs and then translating that to the monetary value for the contract, it aligned with the UK's fair share of the amount of money needed globally to provide a pull incentive, according to Kevin Outerson's published estimates around fair share. So that alignment between payments informed by modelling QALYs and fair share payments supported our move to the sort of more pragmatic evaluation approach of a points-based scoring system to determine the value of our contracts. So on the next slide then, this is all in the lead up to one of the questions I was asked to present on, which is how we developed the evaluation criteria, sort of in a bit more detail, who was involved, how did we get there. So as I said, there were a reflection of the drivers of value that we identified in the pilot's economic modelling and also the committee deliberations around that modelling. And it was so important we did that modelling to get an estimate of the value and give us confidence that we're getting value for money at the amounts we normally consider in the UK anyway, of £20,000 to £30,000 per quality adjusted life year gained, whilst also paying enough to incentivise R&D, so our fair share. And then as for how we refine the wording of the criteria, the evidence requirements and the points available, so we worked with practicing clinicians and AMR experts who have roles in government advisory committees and our National Health Service, and who have sort of dual responsibilities for providing leadership, advice and support across a specific area of healthcare. So specifically, and of course each sort of country has their own structures and advisory boards, but the NHS, or NHS England, has an antimicrobial prescribing and medicines optimisation programme with a lead pharmacist and several regional pharmacists. So we engaged with them to develop the criteria, and we have a UK government advisory committee on antimicrobial prescribing, resistance and healthcare associated infection, APRI. So they were really heavily involved. And then to inform the criteria around the UK unmet needs, we looked to the UK Health Security Agency, UKHSA. So among other things, they're responsible for surveillance of antimicrobial use and resistance. And then for the weights I showed you earlier, we used an elicitation exercise called the swing, using the swing weighting method to get to those using those same group of experts. We also got feedback from industry, really helpful to engage with manufacturers and developers to test the feasibility of the evidence requirements, and we ran a public consultation. And before I move on to my next slide, I should note you'll have noticed the evaluation criteria that I showed before have been designed for antibiotics, specifically those active against the WHO critical priority pathogen list. That was for pragmatic reasons of designing and implementing the model as quickly as possible after the pilot. So we focused the evaluation criteria on the areas of highest unmet need, but the ambition is we'll adapt and expand those criteria over the years to include other products. So there's no policy intention to exclude any products. In principle, this model can apply to a diverse range, provided the sort of that need for the pull incentive is there. So there's a broken market because of the need for stewardship, because of the phenomenon of AMR. And then on to my final slide, I was asked to sort of comment on our rationale for such a comprehensive set of criteria, 17 criteria. And as I said earlier, based on the evidence we saw from the pilot and the drivers of value through the modelling and the committee deliberations, so we know we're getting value for money. And also we try to really recognise the wider public health and population level sort of benefits that we know are really important for addressing AMR. But what this broad set of criteria allows us to do is differentiate between different products which bring different value to patients and the healthcare system and AMR. So we want to be able to pay the upper end of our fair share for a real breakthrough innovative product, so that the 24 million top value contract, and incentivise really good evidence generation and innovation to attract that top contract. But we also want to be able to incentivise and reward other products that maybe aren't as effective, but offer something towards diversifying and strengthening our armoury of drugs against AMR. And we hope ultimately to achieve sort of three things with this style of pull incentive, this subscription model. So we get that commercial viability to develop more products and strengthen the pipeline, to strengthen R&D. Because of the various contractual obligations in place, it also ensures that supplies are maintained after product launch, and also has the benefit of ensuring good stewardship, because by paying this fixed fee, even in the face of low sales, companies have no reason to encourage over-prescribing. And that was everything from me. Thank you for your time. You can take the slides down. There is a final slide if you want to share them afterwards with some sort of resources and links.
Great. Thank you very much, Sophie, and thanks to Mark also for the earlier question. I apologise. At the start, I should have said these sessions are being recorded just so that we can properly capture the information shared and the discussions and learnings from that. We now have an opportunity for some questions. I was going to kickstart that by, I guess, a question addressed to Marco in a sense, is that is it going to be possible for the EU to set up a scoring system along the same lines as what Sophie described in the UK? And Marco, you talked in your talk about being willing to work with the system, as it were, so who should be involved in the definition of those criteria. And I guess you also talked about flexibility and sort of what should they be revised at intervals and so on. So perhaps Marco, if you could initially talk to that question, and obviously there's opportunity for the rest of the attendees to ask questions or comments. Thank you very much. And again, if you're going to talk here in the room in Spinelli, please press on and off your microphone when you speak and when you stop speaking. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Colm, for the question. And indeed, you know, the idea now is to look into how to frame these and to understand how really we can come up with some objective criteria that could help, you know, ranking all these products and understanding which one will be eligible. And I do believe that what Sophie showed could be a good starting point, and I completely agree that the more we get aligned, the better it's gonna be. Which does not mean that at the end, you know, there could be some variation also on the granularities. Sometimes when it gets too over granular and, you know, with a fixed number associated, you know, can become a bit stiff and maybe not representing what really people and experts think. And this is based on my experience with other type of ranking of products, like, you know, for prioritization of clinical trials and so on. But definitely, I think it's a good starting point, and there are good elements that I do believe should be captured anyway. And therefore, you know, we will try to reason along this line to try to come up with a system that would be compatible and would help, you know, taking decision in the right direction with respect to the value of each product. Of course, you know, we would like to see what at the end will be the mandate to the EMA, which at this point is not yet fixed. And indeed, what will be the final goal of any ranking that we will be doing. But we are very much open to look into that and to do something that will be helpful in this sense.
Super. Thanks, Marco. I'm just keen that other attendees, so Christine Ardal from the Norwegian Public Health Agency. Thanks, Christine.
Thanks, Colm. Can I ask Sophie, when you go through and look at the different criteria, how many people are actually rating these, and what kind of conversation happens throughout the process? Thank you.
To clarify, Christine, do you mean during the evaluation? So who's involved in scoring the products to get to the contract value?
That's right. Thank you.
Yeah, so we've recruited a special and bespoke standing committee at NICE to do these and only these evaluations. I can, while people are talking, actually pull up a list of those committee members and send it over. I can't remember what our final sort of count of the committee was. I feel like it might be in the region of about 15 people with a real broad range of expertise. The biographies are all published, so I can send that to avoid taking up sort of airtime here. And each product, I mean, at the moment, while the process is ongoing, all of the deliberations and the outcomes are confidential. But when the process is concluded and the contracts are awarded, we will publish an account of those deliberations. So we're hoping that will be really helpful in others sort of learning from the experience and how we actually apply these in practice, because you'll have an account of the committee's deliberations and the sort of the evidence that they considered. But they spend about a day on each product, so it's a real detailed deliberation. And I would say to Colin's question about sort of the transferability of this scoring system, I would hope the really attractive thing about it is that it doesn't rely on local HTA functions and hundreds of experts in health economics. It's a pragmatic system that could be rolled out anywhere, regardless of sort of HTA setup and that kind of thing. But with the confidence that it was based in an attempt at a cost effectiveness analysis, and we get confidence in that sort of sense of value for money, and hopefully other jurisdictions can bypass the really, really long and challenging process that the UK has been through to get from the conception of this in predated my time in the team. I don't know, years of work to get to this stage. So hopefully it's pragmatic enough to do that. But I'll look at the committee list and I'll circulate it somehow.
This is Mark Gitzinger speaking. I have also a comment and question towards Sophie. First of all, the comment, thank you very much to the UK and to this system. I think this point system makes a lot of sense and is extremely well balanced regarding the goal that we would actually like to achieve, also on a global level. But one of the questions is around the flexibility. I give you one specific example, maybe too technical, but you say that there's extra points, for instance, for different dosage forms, like from IV to oral step down, for instance, etc. I think for some products that makes sense. For other products that are really directed only at hospital and so forth, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So what is the flexibility of your expert committee to say, to adopt slightly these criteria to the product that they're actually looking at?
Really good question, and that actually was one criterion that there was a lot of debate around in the division when we were devising it, with exactly your point. That for some products that's not appropriate, and you're in a situation where you're in intensive care and an oral drug maybe isn't relevant, and that was accounted for in the scoring system and looking at it more holistically as a whole. So of course, and when we sort of calibrated it and looked at different product profiles, so we ran a few sort of hypothetical product profiles through the scoring system, and not having an oral formulation doesn't necessarily preclude you from being in the top value band. You don't need top points to get top contract values. So there are sort of, we felt that looking at it together on the whole, looking at the weightings and the other criteria and sort of, these hypothetical profiles, that would all balance out. But to your real question around the flexibility, this all operates under a procurement process. It's wrapped up in our NHS procurement process, and that's a little different again from anyone familiar with how NICE work from some of the deliberations that our committees might have in a situation, or for example in the pilot when there was all these sort of big evidence gaps, and we rely on committee expertise to kind of fill those evidence gaps, because we knew it would, it was full of uncertainty. But because we've sort of done that in the pilot, we've gone from this from that approach to this very pragmatic, simplified, specific approach, there isn't that same sort of latitude, because it wouldn't be fair. You know, if we start moving away from the criteria and interpreting differently for different products, there's a real risk of unfairness, and then sort of not achieving that objective of differentiating different products. So we've tried to address all of that in actually the design of the criteria to make sure that actually we can sort of stick to them as they're designed. But of course, you know, they're not set in stone forever. I know, Colin, you asked the question around how often these should be updated, and of course, if we learn from our implementation of it that things aren't working as intended, things are being inappropriately penalised, then there is the opportunity to adapt and make tweaks. Of course, we need to balance that with, you know, giving companies and investors security and surety in how to design their development program, because of course the R&D process is long, so we need to give them a sort of clear signal long in advance. So we don't want to be making major changes on a regular basis, but because the way that this works in the UK on a procurement cycle annually, there is that opportunity each year when the tender opens to make tweaks if we think they're needed. If that helps.
Right,
Colin,
thanks, Sophia. I think
we have
Deepali
a hand.
Patel.
Yeah, we have a hand up online with Nick Crabb has his hand up.
Thanks very much. Yeah, just building on what Sophie was saying. I think one feature that's really important here is the compatibility with the multitude of HTA systems across Europe. So I think we basically have two types of approaches in different sort of member states. So in one case, they don't really do the cost utility analysis that we do at NICE routinely, and instead they sort of they look at the clinical evidence and sort of qualitatively come up with the level of added value compared to existing products. And then there's a whole bunch of other member states where they do similar to NICE, and they do actually do that sort of quantitative health economics. And then in some of the bigger markets, there's a mixture of both. They sort of use the health economic approach where necessary, but not necessarily on everything. And I think the design of this and the history of this means that it's this really should be adoptable in any of those sort of whatever those approaches, because the actual final scoring system would be much more analogous to the added value and the sort of qualitative consideration. But because, as Sophie outlined, this is very much rooted in a really complex project we did, where we tried to apply cost utility analysis with some success, but all the learning was then sort of distilled into a much simpler scoring system. This should really do it for everybody. And so if there's anything we can do to sort of help articulate that with HTA agencies in individual member states, I think we'd be very receptive to helping in any way we can. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.
Hi, thanks. Tara Hartwiger, Office of MEP Völken, who's the rapporteur on the pharmaceutical regulations, where we will discuss the AMR incentives. To the UK model, maybe just a more general question. What made the UK at the end opt for the subscription model and not go, for example, for the transferable exclusivity voucher or milestone prices? That would be interesting what the thought behind that was. Thanks.
I can come in on that briefly and then invite Nick and David, who preceded my involvement in the project, who might be able to expand on it. But I tried to touch on it before. It kind of offers all of the things that we want from an incentive. So it gives that commercial viability. It's offering our fair share and stimulating innovation and R&D. It's not just an access scheme. So it's got that R&D, fair share, viability aspect. But then, really importantly, it has the reassurances in the contract that we have a surety of supply, that we will then have adequate access. And really importantly, in the field of AMR, that stewardship, the stewardship is bedded into the model because the money is delinked from sales. We don't have that sort of behavioural issue of encouraging overprescribing. So that's how I would sort of summarise it. But happy for Nick and David to chip in.
Right, thank you very much. I'm just conscious of time, really. Is that okay? Is it really pressing questions? If it's quick, but let's go with that.
I will try to be very quick, and it's not a question, it's just more to complement what Marco said. I'm from the European Commission, Alexandra Opalska from DG Sante. I think it's important to explain to the audience that we created at the Commission a toolbox. So we have those financial incentives that Jean-Baptiste will tell you about, and then regulatory within the pharma legislation. And we need to think about the criteria. The basic criteria are set already in the proposal of the Commission. Let's see, of course, how the negotiation goes with the Parliament, hopefully very well. And then we can work, of course, with EMA, European Medicines Agency, to work on the nuances, on the criteria, further detailed criteria, and the guidelines from them. I think it was important to explain to the audience. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you very much. And just before we move on to the next session, I just want to thank Sophie and Marco for their contributions, but I also want to finish with a plea in a sense that assuming the EU progresses with a pull incentive with clearly defined eligibility and evaluation criteria, with my biotech hat on, it's really important that companies are able to openly say that they are eligible and for this scheme. And so we already get asked at Infex, are you eligible for the UK subscription model with stuff in our pipeline? So Marco and your colleagues in EMA and the other European colleagues, I think it's really important that there's some designation as, in principle, eligible for a pull incentive that can happen fairly early on in a product's pipeline development, because that's something investors are going to be really interested in.